Professor Marc Shapiro, thank you for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
Happy to be here.
I want to ask you about your new book, Renewing the Old, Sanctifying the New, the Unique Vision of Rav Kook. What was your specific impetus for writing this book? It seems a little bit different from some of the others you've written about German Jewry, etc.
Well, about 25 years ago, I got a copy of the Shmona Kvatzim of Rav Kook. These were writings that basically had been suppressed. The complete notebooks, the portions of it had appeared, but not the complete notebooks. And I started reading it, and I was hooked. And from that point on, I bought all of the new writings of Rav Kook that appeared. And although many people are drawn to Rav Kook, I found myself being drawn to different aspects of Rav Kook than others are drawn to. So I thought it would be worthwhile writing a book focusing on what I thought was significant in Rav Kook, what spoke to me, which, as I said, is not what you find normally in discussions of Rav Kook.
And you make that clear both in your introduction and conclusion that this is a very personal book in the sense of the aspects of Rav Kook's thought that really spoke to you personally, and others would have written a very different book, you say, because different ideas that he presents would be interesting to them. I want to say that a friend of mine once said to me that a lot of people who are Haredi think they don't like Rav Kook because they look at him as a Zionist. And my friend said, thank God they don't actually read what he wrote, or they really wouldn't like him at all. So can you talk about some of these important ideas that Rav Kook espoused that were atypical for a rabbi living in the early part of the 20th century?
Okay, well, first, it's interesting that you say that because I spoke on the new book a few weeks ago in London, and a Hasidic rabbi was in attendance, and he came up to me afterwards and says, now he understands why the Haredim don't like Rav Kook. Look, there's a lot of ideas that I discuss in the book, which we will deal with, which they would have found problematic. But even without getting into what's in the book, some of his classic ideas. So, for instance, the idea that the irreligious have something to offer the religious. It's not just a one-way street from the religious to the irreligious. The irreligious, for instance, are the ones who understood it was time to re-enter history, as it were, who understood the need to strengthen our bodies because to become a complete people again, we need that. The idea that we were defective for all these years in the diaspora, and that's related to Zionism, but it's more fundamental. It's the idea that the Jews' real place is the land of Israel, and without it, you're not a complete Jew. And it's precisely the irreligious Jews who recognize the call to return to history. So there's dialectic. There's the religious will give Torah, but the irreligious have something the religious don't have. Rav Kook says we forgot that our bodies are also holy. So the idea of atheism as having something positive. As a makubal, everything, there's holy sparks in everything. So we have to figure out what is positive in atheism. And Rav Kook speaks about, the idea that false ideas of God are being wiped away, and now we can fill it with true ideas. So these are themselves ideas which would be problematic, I think, for traditional circles. But I mean, in my book, I discuss other matters as well, which are found in his previously published books, but really come to fruition, I guess you could say, in the newly released book. So, for instance, the idea that the Jewish masses have something. We're talking about the pious masses that the religious leaders don't have. Again, in yeshivas, you're taught that the rabbi, everything comes from the rabbis. It's a one-way street. And Rav Kook develops the radical idea that, yes, if I want to know if something is muktzah, I have to ask the rabbis, and they teach us about halacha, Judaism, but there's something called natural morality. He calls it musar TV, that's preserved in a purer form, precisely among the masses. Their minds haven't been ruined, if I could use that term, by too much Talmud study and pilpul. They maybe think back to your grandparents who were not great Torah scholars, but they understood what it meant to be a Jew. They had this Jewish feeling, and if the rabbi said something they would say they didn't like, they would say he doesn't know what he's talking about. And Rav Kook develops this idea that, and this is very subversive. You can see why Rav Tzvi Yehuda wouldn't have wanted this to appear, because it removes to a certain extent control of what Judaism is from the rabbis. But I think it actually allows us. I thought of this so that it allows us to answer a big problem in the Haredi world. You have the sexual abuse scandal, in which we know that great rabbis covered it up, and that creates a real problem for the the Haredi model of Das Torah because the rabbis are supposed to have all the answers. But from Rav Kook's perspective, you can see that it's precisely in this area that it was not the leading rabbis. It was the Hamonam, or rabbis of the second level, who understood this was wrong, and they forced the issues and created changes. From Rav Kook's understanding, the idea that sometimes in basic morality, the masses see it better than the rabbis, because if your whole life is Talmud, that doesn't give you insight into the terrible cost of sexual abuse on people. There's nothing in the Gemara that will explain how devastating this is. This comes from a different place. So Rav Kook almost appears as Rousseau in some of his formulations almost. But we can point to things. Look in the Gemara. The Gemara says if you don't know what to do, go out to Puklazi and ask the masses. Why do we go out and ask the masses? Ask the rabbis. I mean, Kol Hamon Kekol Shaddai is an expression. In Einon Navim B'nei Navim Hein. You see already the sages give a pride of place at certain times to the Hamon Am, the religious Hamon Am. Obviously, the religious Hamon Am. In the days of the prophets, the majority of the Jews, it seems, worship the Baal. They don't count. And in our days, the Mahalei Shabbos don't count. But there's a sense of what you call the sense of the faithful, that Rav Kook believed that revelation is also found among the pious Jews, not just in a book sense, but also like in an intuitive sense, passed down. Where the Chasam Sofer says, if your father tells you one thing, and he's referring to someone who's not a great Talmudic scholar, just this the tradition, and your Rebbe tells you something else, you listen to your father. So you have this idea both of the masses and also the family tradition. Rav Kook buys into all this, and I think that would be problematic for many as well.
That gives us a good starting point. I do want to talk about the suppression. We'll get to that a bit later on. But talking about ideas outside of the standard yeshiva curriculum, you already mentioned that he said if you only learn Gemara, your mind can be poisoned, or whatever term you use, to the reality on the ground. But Rav Kook believed not just in learning other aspects of Limudei Kodesh, but also secular studies. What are some of the things that Rav Kook wanted to do to the classic curriculum that Jews had been studying for many years?
Okay, this gets complicated because, as I'll explain, because yes, it's true in Rav Kook's works, and also he was working together with the Nazir, his big student. They imagined a much widened curriculum in which everything from Parshanut to halachic midrash to Jewish philosophy, all the great thinkers, a complete revision of the curriculum. And Rav Kook thought this was important both for its own sake, but also for practical reasons, that there are some people, he writes, who are not drawn to traditional areas of Talmud study and halacha, and we need to give them an outlet. In fact, he says that he sees as one of the big reasons why people reject the Torah Judaism is because people are drawn to traditional sources, but traditional Jewish sources, but not part of the Talmud halacha curriculum. And since they're told that this is not acceptable, like can you imagine 19th century Lithuania to sit and want to focus on Tanakh? People don't realize today what a revolution it is in the religious Zionist world. You have experts in Tanakh. In traditional circles, there wasn't such thing as an expert in Tanakh. There was a Talmud Chacham. But if you tell these people they can't do this, and this is what they're drawn to, they feel like they're rejecting traditional Judaism by doing that, and that leads them to throw off everything. And so he sees that also. He also points out that in halachic matters, if you don't have all the knowledge at your disposal, you're going to be led to be machmir, stringent, because you don't have enough knowledge to be lenient. He says, it's the same thing in matters of Jewish thought. You have many great Talmud scholars, but they don't know about the history of Jewish thought. So they present a very narrow view of what's considered the acceptable approach in understanding Jewish ideas. And if people do not fall into those, they can't accept these limited boundaries, then their attitude will be, well, the rabbis think my views are heretical, then I might as well throw off everything, Shabbos, kashrut, etc. When Rav Kook points out that this is a mistake, because often the rabbis who have these limited boundaries, they don't recognize that there's much broader room. Now, Rav Kook doesn't say what he's referring to, but I think it's obvious, like evolution. Rav Kook spoke about evolution. Rather than telling people if you accept evolution, you're out of traditional Judaism, he shows how evolution could be read in accord with Torah. So he sees this limited approach as actually pushing people out of traditional Judaism. Now,
Let me
And
ask
in
this one
terms
question
of
about that, though.
yeah,
Before we get to
yeah.
secular studies, does that mean that he saw this as a b'diavad, as something which is only necessary because people are going to leave? Or did he see this if he had a blank slate and could create a new curriculum, even for people who are happy with Gemara, that we have to expand it as well?
No, because he said he says that really the real great Talmidei Chachamim, they're called to have a vast knowledge in all areas. But then he also mentions, as a practical matter, the negative results of this limited curriculum. But it's certainly a lechatchila. And he himself writes about how his soul needs to soar and he can't be put into confines like that. And we're speaking now about a widened Torah curriculum, secular studies as well. He speaks about in the area of preceding the time of the Mashiach, that the world will be corrected by the spread of secular knowledge. He says that the Torah scholars will themselves be advocates of this, and they will strengthen faith through secular studies. He even says that sometimes people who oppose secular studies really they oppose. All knowledge, including Torah, and this is how it's expressed. So he writes very eloquently about how secular studies are valuable, and God wants us to know all this. The big problem, however, is that Rav Kook established the yeshiva, Merkas Harav, and not only did he not institute all these matters, secular studies in it, but even with regard to the broadened Torah curriculum, he never instituted it. So how are we to explain that on the one hand, in theory, he speaks about the broadened curriculum both in Torah matters and in secular matters, but in his private life, with his children, let's say, and co-students, and in his yeshiva, which was designed to, at least in theory, to have a new approach to Torah study, everything pretty much kept to the traditional approach, and he didn't institute this. How do you explain this? Well, it's a big question. By the way, Rav Kook also wrote about the positive aspects of academic Jewish studies, what in those days was called Chochmas Yisrael, and yet he never instituted that as well. So again, it's a big problem. Ari Shvat, he's a great scholar on Rav Kook. He deals with the matter of academic Jewish studies, but I think his insights are applicable to all the areas we dealt with. And his argument, which is convincing to me, is basically that when Rav Kook decided to move from theory to practice, he saw that it wasn't so simple, and that there are more important things, especially as he in Eretz Yisrael. Much of his ideas about broadening the curriculum and secular studies on Chutz La'aretz, he saw that the most important thing would be to focus on the study of Tanakh and Emunah, what we call hashkafa. And that's what he put the stress on. However, when it came to special students of his, who he thought their horizons could be enlarged and it would be valuable for them, he did advocate this widened study. But in terms of a general approach, it seems that he abandoned it in practice, not in theory. And in his own yeshiva, at most, you had more of a stress on Tanakh and on Emuna, which is not philosophy. It's not looking at the Rambam. It's maybe reading Ramchal, things like that, but it's not dealing in a serious matter with Jewish philosophical questions. I guess he thought the generation was not yet ready for that, and there's a lot of things the generation wasn't yet ready for, and he put that on the back burner.
Well, in line with what you wrote in your book, it seemed to me, as I was reading it, that there are almost three different categories of potential students. You have the great people like Rav Kook himself, who will not be satisfied with learning a pure Talmudic curriculum. You have the people who are not that religious or who are thinking of leaving, for whom this could be dangerous to only have that in the curriculum. And then you have the people in the middle who are happy with Gemara as it is and who aren't in danger of leaving. Perhaps those are the people who generally attended his yeshiva, just throwing that out. And therefore, there was no need to really apply this to the two other groups. I don't know.
I think that makes sense what you're saying. And there were people who attended the yeshiva who did become much broader and moved in different directions. But this isn't something that, wasn't part of the yeshiva curriculum. There, let me clarify this, however, a little. Later on, the Nazir would give shiurim at his house. He'd give shiurim on Kuzari, and the Nazir had a broader view than Rav Tzvi Yehuda. In fact, each of them, although Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook, of course, is a great student of his father, the greatest, the Nazir, I guess, is number two. And they didn't see eye to eye on everything. And the Nazir continued to want to broaden the curriculum. It never really happened in the yeshiva itself. And when Tzvi Yehuda took over, it also never happened. There was a stress on Emunah, aspects of Emunah, in particular Rav Kook's writings. But the academic Jewish studies and the serious philosophical study of Rishonim, that the Nazir actually prepared a curriculum for Rav Kook on this. He even included study of Krachmal, by the way. That never happened except for what we might call yechidei school, special people who were initiated into that by the Nazir.
Okay, I want to move on to another point that you mentioned in terms of Rav Kook's radical thought. Obviously, Rav Kook believed in the binding nature of halacha, but he also talks about how some people might be able, theoretically, and maybe not theoretically, to transcend the need for certain halachot. Could you give some examples of what this means?
I mean, there's texts that rabbinic texts that speak about atid lavo, whatever that means, messianic era, after resurrection, whatever it is, sometime in the future where halachot will not be binding the way they are now. So Rav Kook speaks about this. For instance, he speaks about prayer. You can imagine, and this is the Hasidic world also, you find this. I mean, the whole notion that you're obligated to pray at certain times by a certain hour for someone who's enraptured with the love of God, the idea that you can tell them at this time you have to pray and other times you don't, that could be problematic. And Rav Kook speaks about how troubling it is for people, and he's referring to himself as well, obviously, to be lost in pratim, the details of halacha. But he's not an antinomian in the sense that nothing here is practical. I guess you could say it's a theoretical antinomianism. What he's doing is he's calling attention to the difficulty of a spiritual person like himself to be bound to all these particular rules. But he never abandons it. And in fact, he says, even though it's difficult, the spiritual person still has to observe it because he's part of Klal Yisrael. So it's not a practical antinomianism. It's more theoretical in the sense he's calling attention to the difficulty, but yet you bind yourself to it with everyone else. This is very different than like Rav Soloveitchik, halachic man. In fact, I would say Rav Kook is Agadic man, if you understand Agadah as encompassing philosophy and Kabbalah and all that. But it's a very honest portrayal of one who really doesn't want to be held down in this earth, wants to soar. And you have themes like this in Kabbalistic literature and Hasidic literature of the tzaddik, is the tzaddik. And we know that the only area where this comes to fruition in Hasidus with the tzaddik has to do with the Zmani tefillah, or they can't be bound by the times. But for the most part, it wasn't. And Rav Kook doesn't really speak about it in other areas in detail. He simply mentions the difficulty of the spiritual person to be constricted in pratim and prate pratim, which could be understood as just the study of particulars, going into all the details of Yoredeya. But it also seems to include even the concern with practice. But it doesn't mean you don't do it. It just means that's not where he finds his spirituality in there. Look, at the end of the day, this is something which would also be problematic for many, is Rav Kook is a great posek. There's no question about it, one of the leading poskim. But if you read him, you see that's not where his heart was. He has to do that because he's a Rav. He even says he's good at it, but that's not where he wants to be. He wants to be in what he sees as a higher area, Kabbalah, understanding God, spirituality, it's whereas for Rav Soloveitchik, the higher area is not the practical halacha, it's the theoretical halacha Talmudic learning. For Rav Kook, the higher level is these more spiritual, personal connections to God. And you can imagine him, as I write in the book, soaring in mystical rapture, and then a woman knocks on his door he has to paskin a shaila about the chicken. So you see that this is definitely not where his heart was, and he tells us this explicitly. And I'll just add, and I think the religious Zionist yeshivas, they've picked up on this because now you have religious Zionist yeshivas that the old approach was just Gemara and halacha. Now you have yeshivot that focus on Chassidut and Parshanut, a very broad curriculum in many yeshivas. And that's exactly what Rav Kook was speaking about.
So that's interesting you raised Rav Soloveitchik. At least Rav Soloveitchik, as he portrays the halachic man, how much that reflects his own personal religious attitude is an interesting open question. But working within that halachic man concept, the Brisker idea of Chaim Brisker, there's very much an idea that halacha and Judaism are, to whatever degree we can say this, synonymous. If it's not halachic, it's not really important to that halachic man. If it has no way of being expressed in a halachic terminology, it has no real religious value, at least on a superficial level, I can say that, and perhaps more than a superficial level. That leads to the question, which I've been thinking about a lot. For Rav Kook, would you say that halacha is not synonymous with Judaism, but rather a part of Judaism, as opposed to this other attitude, which says that Judaism and halacha are really one and the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, the Rav, as you correctly point out, I mean, his whole idea is that you develop a philosophy out of the halacha, and but again, the theoretical halacha, this is the old Lithuanian approach. When you had to become a Rav of a Kehila, so then you went and learned Yoredeya. But the theoretical learning of halacha was for him the basis of all. For Rav Kook, it's obviously not the case. Rav Kook, Judaism is so much more than halacha. I mean, you have typologies. Professor Tursky already wrote about these typologies of halachist, Kabbalist, philosopher, where they put the stress on. And Professor Tursky, for instance, was fond of citing Yosef ibn Kaspi in his Ethical Will. He tells a story that once he's at a meal, and let's say the milk spoon falls in with the meat, so he has to go to the rabbi and ask the rabbi the question. And then he writes, he says, I'm not embarrassed to admit I don't know the answer because I know more important things, understanding man's connection to God. So he sees the rabbi here as a technician, to decide halacha. And in the Hasidic world as well, the most important figure is not the posek, the Rav, it's the Rebbe. If you have a halacha question, so then you go to the technician. And Rav Kook is really follows along those lines. Now, in terms of the Rav's halacha command, what you also said is correct. How much he saw himself. He says right at the beginning there that he's creating a typology, like economic man, but it still shows you where his stress is. And Rav Kook is different than that. There's passages of Rav Kook and where he speaks about how he's constricted and he wants to break out of these chains. You can never find that in Rav Soloveitchik.
Let's move on to the literal truth of Torah, because you suggest that Rav Kook was very open to the idea that the Torah can use false historical and scientific assumptions that were accepted by the people who received the Torah at Sinai as a framework in which the true message of the Torah would be presented. Could you give some examples of where Rav Kook presented this as a reality that the Torah actually uses?
Well, he's speaking first about astronomical, Ptolemaic, or Copernican ideas. Does the Torah teach us these things? No, he says the Torah is not concerned with astronomy, whether it's a Ptolemaic world or Copernican world. It's not concerned with geology, archaeology, going back to primordial historical truths. It expresses himself, as he says, in accord with the people of the time the Torah was revealed, believed. And this is done, he says, in order for the Torah to accomplish its goal, which is not to teach science or history or historical matters, but rather, as he says, knowledge of God, of ethics, et cetera, et cetera. He says explicitly that the Torah, that prophecy, and that includes the Torah, uses conceptions that are, quote, generally accepted, even if mistaken. So the question is, where do you draw the line? Is it only the stories at the beginning of Bereshis, where it's clear that they can be interpreted in a non-historical fashion, or has the door been opened to other sections as well? And Rav Kook was asked this question and answered in 1912 in a letter to his student, Moshe Seidel. Moshe Seidel was one of those students who Rav Kook encouraged to study Semitics. He actually comes to America, teaches at Yeshiva College for a while. And Rav Kook says in his letter that he admitted that there is no clear dividing line between that which can be understood in a non-historical way and that which is taken in a literal fashion. The only guidance he could offer is that the Jewish people as a whole will come to proper insight. He says as follows: although not every individual can distinguish precisely between what the Torah said allegorically and literally, the nation's clear sense finds the path, not through isolated proofs, but through general intuition. So he's sort of punting here because he doesn't tell you how far you could bring this. Can you speak about numbers in the Torah, huge numbers leaving Egypt. Are those symbolic? Not are those what the people believed and therefore recorded? Are various events in the Torah? Is it is the history itself important? He doesn't tell us, but he sets out a principle that this is something that's in accord with Torah, and also that the people will find their answer. It could be that the general intuition comes slowly as science and history becomes more understood. After all, Rav Kook, when he dealt with evolution, this is something that would have been unimaginable, let's say 100 years before. But the evidence, the scientific evidence, is what caused people to look again at Torah and say, can it be that this is required to be viewed historically, literally, when we're told something else by science? And of course, the Rambam already spoke about this matter in dealing with the eternity of the world, Aristotle, Plato, and the Torah's conception. So it could be that for good reason he doesn't explain further, because this is the sort of thing that only future generations confronted with different issues will be able to deal with. And his issue was the beginning of Bereshis and the history there, evolution, age of the universe, etc. I mean, this is usually phrased as a dispute of Torah and science, but as I say in the book, it's really Torah and history. History that we know through science, but history that we know through science tells us, for instance, that humans have lived throughout the world a lot longer than 5,000 years old. Remember, one of the issues here, it's not just the creation of the world that you can talk about, eons, but because traditional Judaism also speaks about humanity only being on earth for under 6,000 years. So what do you do when you have evidence of humanity living a lot longer from all over the world? So those are the issues that Rav Kook is concerned with, especially Rav Herzog in the later generation is even more concerned with it. Rav Kook is primarily concerned, it seems, just with evolution, age of the universe, the spread of humanity. That, I think, comes a little bit after him. But Rav Kook sets out this principle, which how far you could take it, I guess that'll be debated. There was a debate some years ago in tradition over the flood story. Is that teaching us history, or is it art, historical history, and the rest sort of metaphor, or teaching us lessons? I mean, these are the issues that in the Orthodox world they've been debated and continue to be debated. In fact, I know on your own podcast you had Rafi Zaram on it, and he dealt with some of these issues as well.
Yeah, that's right. And in fact, I know that our mutual teacher, Professor Marvin Fox, wrote an article where he talks about the Ramban at the beginning of Bereshit saying things here are not literal. And I know that a big question is, what was the Ramban referring to? Was he talking only about the first parak, the first stories in Bereshit, or also Parshat Noach? The question is, how far do you extend the Ramban to? These are questions that go back to the Rishonim, not just for Rav Kook.
Yeah, I mean, you have the Tower of Babel. I mean, sometimes people like to say the first 11 chapters are different than the ones after, then you really enter history. Rav Kook doesn't say that, but that's an interesting approach. And these were the things that Rav Herzog was dealing with. Yeah.
And you talk about Rav Herzog extensively in that same chapter. You have a back and forth correspondence with him as well. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about the limits of this approach in a different way, because you cite a quote from Yehuda Mirsky's biography of Rav Kook. The book is entitled Rav Kook, Mystic in a Time of Revolution. And the quote goes like this: he, meaning Rav Kook, suggests that one may accept the findings of biblical criticism and still keep faith with tradition. And while you say his book is a wonderful book, you disagree with Mirsky on this particular issue. And you say this quote is somewhat misleading. Can you explain why this is misleading?
Yeah, because the quote, as I read it, implies that Rav Kook was willing to accept biblical criticism as in line with traditional Judaism. But that's not what Rav Kook says. Rav Kook completely opposes biblical criticism. But for those who unfortunately do accept biblical criticism, there's no reason to throw out Torah and mitzvos, because even with this assumption, we can find a way to require Torah and mitzvos from a different approach. But factually, Rav Kook still sees biblical criticism as incorrect and a false idea that should be uprooted. But as I said, Nebuch, for those people who've fallen into this doesn't mean they should just throw out Torah, because there's other reasons to observe Torah. You can view it as something from the rabbis, and we follow the rabbis as well, or minhag. There's all sorts of reasons. He's trying to keep people in the fold, even if they have accepted a doctrine which he views as completely unacceptable.
In that way, it reminds me of what you mentioned before, the Rambam and the eternity of the world, where the Rambam was using that as an assumption. Let's work with this assumption. It doesn't mean he accepted that assumption, however.
Correct. But if there was, but the difference is that he's saying if you could accept, for example, eternal matter, if eternal matter was proven, then we'd have to reinterpret the Torah. Rav Kook doesn't go that far. He just assumes that biblical criticism is incorrect, but that doesn't mean you throw out the Torah if you have a false idea. We can have people with all sorts of false ideas and still be Torah observant. And the idea, of course, is that Torah will bring them back.
And that's why he didn't want to say that heretics are simply outside the fold and don't bother with them, because a heretic remains a heretic. But if they observe it, perhaps they will overcome their heresy. Is that what you mean?
More than that, even Rav Kook says in an amazing passage in Shmona Kvatzim, right at the beginning, that Rav Tzvi Yehuda, had he published this, it would have had done a lot of good in the religious Zionist world, maybe stop some of the heresy hunting. Rav Kook says that we don't regard someone as a heretic and outside the fold unless his heresy leads to practical application, that is, rejection of halacha. He's not advocating orthopraxy, but he's saying that the orthoprax individual is still in the community and is not regarded as a heretic. If in a halachic sense, he could believe in heresy. He says in this, we are like what the Ravad says. The Ravad rejects the Rambam. The Rambam says if someone believes God has a physical form, he's out. And the Ravad says, why does he say he's a heretic? Plenty of great people thought that. They don't know any better. Rav Kook adopts this approach, which, first of all, opens up all sorts of implications to how we deal with the questioner, the orthodox, the skeptic who's still observant, and it also is a complete rejection of the Rambam's entire system of the 13 principles, because denial of certain principles does not render you a heretic unless this also manifests itself in violation of Jewish law, in rejection of the communal norms.
Yeah, it would be great if somebody wrote a book about Rambam's 13 principles. I think that would be a very worthwhile endeavor, Marc.
You can see why I was attracted to that passage.
Yeah, for sure. I want to cite one more quote from that book by Professor Mirsky. This is the quote he says, because I found it very radical as well, and I'd like your take on it. Thus, he continues, speaking of Rav Kook, contemporary heretics are right to say that the literal truths of tradition and scripture, the veils, cannot be the truth. Where the heretics stumble is in failing to provide an alternative that can recognize the distance between human and divine truth, and yet still, like the Torah, serve as a basis for ethics. This idea that the literal truth of Scripture can't be the truth, which is what Professor Mirsky says, is a very radical statement. Do you think this is an accurate portrayal of Rav Kook's position?
When you say literal truth, what do you mean by literal truth? So, for instance, Rav Kook says that these atheists are atheists. They don't really reject God. What they're rejecting is the false idea of God that they were indoctrinated. They strive for a higher idea of God. So at the end of the day, for Rav Kook, nothing really that we can't say anything, for instance, about God. Anything we say is going to be false. Some can get closer than others to the truth, but nothing really we say theologically is a pure, correct description. So the heretics, the believers are incorrect in what they say, and the heretics are also incorrect. Of course, the heretics, they also manifest their incorrectness in not observing the halacha. So, but the truth is that no one really can express the truth in its absolute form. I think that's what he's referring to there. I mean, the heretics point out one of their values is they point out so many of the problems that the traditional Jews have in the way they express things. It could be about prayer. It could be about how God, I mean, think of all the preachers, Orthodox preachers will talk about how God is angry that we do this and that. Well, if you think for a minute, you realize God, isn't it a basic assumption? God doesn't have emotions. God doesn't have anger. So the heretics, they reject this, but they don't have anything, and they're correct actually to reject this because God doesn't have anger, but they don't have anything to replace it with. And I think that's what Mirsky's referring to, and this shows you the dialectic and the complicated nature of Rav Kook, because he's pointing out correctly that many of the things that the heretics say are correct in an absolute philosophical sense. We just forget about this because we feel it's okay to speak about God getting angry or God doing this and that. And the heretics deny all of this. So in a sense, they have that's the holy spark in what they're doing, and they're calling us to a more refined view of God.
Okay, let's move forward into the idea of natural law, the idea of natural morality, and how it relates to halakha. So, how did Rav Kook relate to that idea of natural law, which you already said on some level? He says people have this inherently in them. What was his feeling about that? And in particular, what would he suggest people do when halakha and natural morality are in conflict?
And there are examples where he acknowledges that they're in conflict. Look, at the end of the day, halacha needs to be followed, but it's not so simple as that because we also have the natural morality. He calls it Musar TV, and it's clear for him that that is something intuitive among the religious Jews, something you sense it's a different sort of revelation. Now, this can become a radical idea. Well, it already is a radical idea. So, for instance, Tamar Ross, or she develops the whole idea that Orthodox feminism is an example of this unfolding revelation. Now we recognize women as a different sort of person than we used to, and therefore this calls upon us for all sorts of changes. And she sees that as an example of what Rav Kook is speaking about. But that's an extrapolation. We have enough if we just look at what Rav Kook himself says. And Rav Kook says that he says that the job of the Sanhedrin can the Sanhedrin can actualize new moral and religious insights that have become apparent. Now, what's important is that this isn't these insights, this intuition is not something we get from secular society. It isn't that we have halacha and then we're influenced by the broader world and then we want to update halacha. There's no evolution of halacha. His student Moshe Seidel mistakenly understood Rav Kook to be speaking about evolution of halacha, maybe along the lines of the conservative movement, and he wrote to Rav Kook, and Rav Kook is very upset. He says there's no evolution here. What it is a revealing of that which is latent or was latent in the Torah, which only now, because of historical circumstances, can be revealed. You know, Rav Kook sees us as moving to a higher state. Normally, we think of moving down. But as you come close to the Messianic era, especially from a Kabbalistic perspective, more holy sparks are released. In certain areas, we're moving higher, closer. So, for instance, the fact is that people used to only do the good or abstain from the bad because they were afraid that they'd be punished by God, or they thought they'd get a reward. Now, Rav Kook, he sees people who are atheists, who reject everything, and yet they're sacrificing themselves for social justice, for the good. That's a very high level. They're not doing it because of any expectation of reward or punishment. And so once you understand that over time certain insights can be revealed, then you're going to have issues that appear to be in conflict with halacha. And that's where the Sanhedrin comes in, because the Sanhedrin is able to actualize these moral insights by takanot, by creating a new law through the use of drashot. This isn't conservative or reform. This is in the Rambam. That halachas that were derived from the sages by means of drashot, psukim, a later Sanhedrin, even if it's not as great, can change that. And he gives some examples. So, for instance, there's a halacha category called Mechemes Rishus, that the king can decide. Of course, he has to get agreement, the Sanhedrin, but he can decide to go to war. Now, to expand his territory. This idea today is not something that anyone can accept, the idea that you just go to war to expand territory. And Rav Kook mentions that this is the sort of idea that was suitable in an earlier era, but today it's, as humanity has improved, you say that it's only suitable for a world that hasn't developed, but a world that will develop in a proper moral way, that'll be put on the backside. So, same thing with slavery. He says that this was well, it's interesting because in his letters, he has will make us very uncomfortable. He has a different view of slavery, that certain people are destined to be slaves. But in his other writings, he says that slavery is for an era that hasn't yet developed properly. He speaks about the idea of Yifat Torah the same way. So Rav Kook acknowledges that Torah truth can be revealed over time, and this then will lead the Sanhedrin to a different understanding. Sacrifices. He sees us as moving to an era when there will not be animal sacrifices. And that'll be because we'll be more sensitive to life. We won't even be able to take any life, animal or human. What then to do with explicit psukim in the Torah that require us to do sacrifices? So that's the job of the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin is the only one that's able to determine, do these new feelings come from a proper place and therefore can be validated through drashot, or are we absorbing outside non-Jewish views, and therefore they cannot be validated. So this is something Rav Kook pushes off to the future, but he definitely recognizes that we're going to be in a different era in the future. He says that many of the chumras that have arisen, they were because of the diaspora, and we will not need them in the future, the Messianic era. We'll be a different place. But he also says we'll have new chumras that are suitable for an independent Jewish people living in their land. So that's how he deals with it.
So based on what you're saying, it sounds like he would not say that he's disagreeing with the Rambam that all the laws of the Torah are eternal. He's saying, no, that law had an inner meaning, and that is retained. We're not changing the Torah. We're certainly taking out the latent meaning inside of it and using that. Is that how he would explain it? Or would he see himself in conflict?
Exactly. And in fact, he even raises the question himself when he deals with his notion of sacrifices. Well, what about the Rambam that says the Torah is eternal? And he explains why it's not. I mean, he could have said, well, we don't accept the Rambam. There are midrashim that don't accept the Rambam in this matter, the Torah law being eternal. But he says, no, this is in accord with the Rambam also. So, for instance, let me say sacrifices for a minute. He's not talking about the Carbon Pesach. Well, maybe in the future that as well, because he has a vegetarian view. But he's talking about other sacrifices where you don't need it. I think that's primarily, at least that would be the beginning stages, but all this is going to be when we reach a higher level of vegetarianism. So he says the Torah speaks of sacrifices as a reach nicholach, a sweet savor. But when we can no longer regard it as a sweet savor, then the law won't be applicable. He has this idea that the animals will be raised to a higher state in some time in the future. Well, they'll be like our friends. They won't. So therefore, when the Torah speaks about sacrificing animals, these are no longer animals. They're not the animals the Torah speaks about. So it's not in violation of the Rambam's principle of Torah to be eternal, because the era we're going to be in will be a different era, and the law of the Torah is not applicable. He provides the drashot that the future Sanhedrin can use to update, if you want to use that term, the halacha with regard to sacrifices. And that's only one. He gives as an option. He's not absolute. Another option he gives is that animals themselves will be at a high level, that they will choose to commit suicide, as it were. They will choose, recognizing how valuable sacrifices are, they will willingly offer themselves. But so he has different options. But he has this notion that at some time, it could be very far in the future, humanity will return to its original state, where we will be vegetarians. We will not be able to consume flesh, and animal sacrifices will be replaced. In the book, unfortunately, I refer to vegetable sacrifices, which he does mention, but he also mentions sacrifices of grains. So I should have said vegetarian sacrifices. Now, on the one hand, he's very firm that there will be sacrifices in the future, but in other writings, he speaks about a future of only vegetarian sacrifices. So it seems, and this is Rav Goren argues, others, that he's speaking of two eras. Original, when we first have return to the sacrifices, of course, it'll be the old system. But over time, slowly, we will reach a stage where we will move beyond that. And the Torah only intended it for a certain time period, not for when we reach that high level of, imagine the level that Adam HaRishon was at, or something like that.
Well, what about in the absence of a Sanhedrin? Meaning, let's say someone has a conflict between their own sense of morality and a halacha that's currently in the Torah, without a Sanhedrin now to talk about the latent meaning within the Torah. Would he say there's anything that person can do, or that person simply has to follow the halacha and put his concerns aside?
There doesn't seem to be any mechanism. I mean, on one hand, Rav Kook says that a fear of heaven, a true fear of heaven, is not going to be create these moral problems. But that's just a nice thing to say. But you can, in reality, there could be examples. And by the way, this doesn't mean that you just decide based on our own views to get rid of, or to get rid of the law of Mamzerus or things like that. It doesn't work like that. Rav Kook doesn't tell us exactly how far to take these matters, but it's not that so we can decide we're going to get rid of it. So without a Sanhedrin as a guard, who's to determine that our feelings, even though there are moral feelings, that they are authentic moral feelings? We're so enmeshed with Western culture that we can't separate what is coming out of Torah and what we're receiving from the outside. So Rav Kook is absolutely clear that this is all for a future Sanhedrin. It's not for anyone in our day to decide based like David Hartman in his last book decided that his own morality refuses to allow him to accept certain halachot. No, that's not what he's referring to. This is all eschatological for Rav Kook. It's not here and now. It's eschatological
And it
in
sounds like the
terms of
Sanhedrin.
in terms of formal changes to halacha. What's not eschatological are matters that are not required but optional. So, for example, ideas of slavery and war and things like that, that we can get a sense of. Basically, he's saying that some things in the Torah are Torah tolerated, but not ideals, and we can move beyond that. But in terms of actually changing required laws, that you need a Sanhedrin, not just from a formal standpoint, like the Rambam tells you, but also because they're the guard to ensure that we're not led astray. Everyone's going to decide what to them is a Torah true value that needs to move the halacha in a different direction. That's not traditional Judaism. Yeah.
Okay. Very interesting. I'd like to move on to the idea of other religions and their transmission of actual truth. So, to what degree do Rav Kook accept that there is truth in other religions? And let me ask, as a follow-up already, what's the limit to that kind of thinking?
Okay. Now, Rav Kook wrote a book, a guide of the perplexed. It's called Linevuche Hador, which he wrote when he was in Chutz La'aretz, and it was never published. Even though after he passed away, when they created a VOD to publish Rav Kook's writings, they included this as one of the things to be published. It never was published. And in 2010, I think it appeared mysteriously on the internet. No one knows how it got on there in a typed form. And 4 years later, Rav Shachar Rahmani published it with a nice introduction and notes. And this book, which is currently being translated to English by Rabbi Aryeh Sklar,
He's my student from my yeshiva.
And I thanked him in my book because he allowed me access to his translation for some of the passages. I only found out right before the book was going to appear that he was working on a translation. You have a number of radical things in this book, and you can understand why it wasn't published. In fact, Eitam Henkin, I can't remember now if he told me this or if he wrote it somewhere, he thinks it's because of what Rav Kook says about other religions. That's why it wasn't published. I'm not sure because they could have published it and left that out. But Rav Kook says some provocative ideas that he doesn't repeat elsewhere. If you look in his other writings, everything he says about other religions is fairly traditional. There's a few exceptions here and there. He speaks about Jesus as having great personal powers, but of course, then he ruined those powers. But even to say that, people thought it was controversial. But in the Minvuchei Ador, you have, and you could have hints perhaps in other writings as well. He speaks about how, something which on the face of it shouldn't be so radical. We believe that there were other prophets, although some people have this notion that other prophets of other nations ended with Bilam, but others won't agree with that. So once you assume that there could be prophets for other nations, is it so crazy to think that God could speak to other nations and instruct them what to do, even in more recent years? Rav Kook argues that the founders of the great religions that came out of Judaism, and that has to refer to Islam and Christianity, and the founders, I assume, is Jesus and obviously Muhammad, he says that they're divinely inspired. What does it mean, divinely inspired? It doesn't mean that God gave them a revelation like the Quran or the New Testament to the later Christian leaders. It means that God inspired them to lead a revolution, to do something good for the non-Jewish world that they were a part of. Yaakov Emden says something very similar. But that you could see that as being radical. And elsewhere, he speaks about the founders of the various religions, which is a larger category than Christianity, Islam. He's having Ruach HaKodesh. Again, what's Ruach HaKodesh? And he's talking about religions untainted by idolatry. So I think he's viewing the religions of the world, even the idolatrous religions, at the beginning of not having yet fallen into idolatry. So Rav Kook sees God as guiding humanity in different ways, and that's not our concern. We have our relation. For Rav Kook, Judaism is obviously the highest level, but it shouldn't bother us, and we should leave it open as a possibility that God also inspired Muhammad. to lead the Arabs and then other people, not Arabs, to a system of morality, or to lead the Christians or the Hindus or anything like that. Yes, the religion then went off in directions which was inappropriate. Rav Kook says they denied the supremacy of Israel and of the Torah and all that. But at least the idea is that nothing happens if it's not hashgacha pratis. For the opponents of Rav Kook, do things just happen? I mean, the Rama himself at the end of the Mishnah Torah speaks about these other religions as being hashgacha pratis. Rav Kook, though, he doesn't just speak about God somehow guiding it. He speaks about having these as special individuals. In a traditional, conception, you can only say negative things about the founders of other religions. Rav Kook says, on the contrary, he speaks about the positive. And then even Jesus, there's something positive, but then he messed it up. And Rav Kook says something amazing. He says that, you have a piece of gold, which is dedicated to idolatry, so we can't have anything to do with it. We have to degrade it. But if it's melted down and then turned into just a nice another piece of gold, we can admire it. He says the same thing about Jesus. As long as he's an avodah zarah for the non-Jews, we can't say anything positive about him. But if they reject him as an avodah zarah and then just look to him as a teacher, then we can look and say, maybe he said some good things. After all, he came from the Jewish world. I'm sure there's some good things there. So Rav Kook is willing to acknowledge divine inspiration, even prophecy, perhaps he mentions, of non-Jewish religious figures. And he goes even further. He says, even miracles. Even miracles they could have done. Again, this doesn't affect us. We're the highest level of religion. That's what he believes, Judaism. But if God chose to be in contact with other figures for their communities, and even gave them the ability to do certain wonders to inspire those people to live lives of spirituality and godliness, that's not something we should reject. It doesn't concern us. It could be true, it could not be true, but it's not our concern, and we don't need to reject that out of hand. And I actually think this was a traditional view, although today people would find it strange. I went on a limb here, but I believe it's correct. You have all sorts of stories in traditional circles of Jesus doing miracles. How is Jesus doing miracles? What's going on here? Well, there's a whole book called Todos Yeshu, which goes back to the Talmud period, which assumes Jesus did all these miracles. Of course, they explain it that he must have, had used the holy powers from the dark side or God's holy name or things like that. But we see that they actually believed, at least some of them, that he did it. And in the book, I say, this is based on the idea that if enough people claim to have seen something, maybe like a Kuzari type of argument, it has to be true. In the medieval period, Jews believed, we have writings of rabbis, that Christian saints could do wonders. But of course, it's all because they knew magic or things like that. Rav Kook comes from a different perspective, and that non-Jewish leaders could also be inspired spiritually. It doesn't affect us at all. Don't we want God to reach out to the world in all these areas and to lead people to a proper understanding of divine truth? So that's what he says. It's I think when you explain it the way I did, it loses some of its radical nature. But reading it for the first time, you're shocked, because we don't have sources like this in our tradition. When Rabbi Jonathan Sacks said very similar things, the outcry was such, the declarations that what he's saying is real heresy, he was forced to withdraw the book that he wrote these matters in. He said, for instance, that God doesn't just speak to Jews. God spoke to Hindus, God spoke to Muslims, God spoke to Christians. He had to take all that out, and what's left afterwards is simply that non-Jews have the Noahide Code. That's it. That's very different than the first edition. And Rabbi Sacks would have been very happy to know that much of what he independently was feeling was anticipated by Rav Kook. So when I said this not long ago in a talk, someone said to me, but the same people who attacked Rabbi Sacks would also have attacked Rav Kook in the exact same way for what he said. But still, at least for Rabbi Sacks, it would have been good to hear that. And maybe he would have been able to cite Rav Kook and not felt the need to withdraw in such a almost humiliating way what he wrote and said, okay, I apologize. I was wrong to say it.
Yeah, well, he actually, what I think he said was, I'm not retracting it, I'm simply explaining what I meant, something along those lines. He says that this is an explanation, not a retraction, something like that.
Yeah, but I don't think if you read both books, he's saying completely separate things.
I only have the original, so I don't know.
The updated version is very conventional. He says in the original, I have not hesitated to speak radical. And he speaks about God speaking, whatever that means, to different communities and different religions, and they have their truth, because truth, he says, is truth is only complete in heaven. Down below, each have a piece of the truth. And Sachs, just like Rav Kook, he's not saying that Judaism doesn't have more of the truth, but Judaism doesn't have all of the truth. Other religions also have truths that have been given to them, and that had to be refined in the second printing.
Yeah, I think one of the lines is, "In heaven there is truth, on earth there are truths." But when I read
Yeah.
that book, I actually felt not, I didn't know Rav Kook, but I really felt that he was echoing consciously or otherwise Rav Soloveitchik in the Halachic Mind. In the Halachic Mind, which I feel is Rav Soloveitchik's most radical book, I don't think that many people necessarily know what he really says there. People know about the last chapter where he says we have to develop Hashkafat Olam out of halacha, but the way he gets there in the first three chapters is pretty radical. And certainly the implication there is that truth is above any given religion. That's at least how I read it.
Yeah, but does that mean now that other religions have a piece of the truth? And I don't just mean truth in the sense if a religion teaches you don't murder, well, that's a truth. I'm talking about specific theological truths. That's what Rav Kook is willing to acknowledge, and that's what Rabbi Sachs was acknowledging, that there could be specific theological truths for other religions that they have received in however they received it, and that's for them. It doesn't challenge us in any way. That's what Rav Kook says in this Guide of the Perplexed of his, and we can try to reconstruct why he was led to this. What did he learn about the world? Now, he says all this at the same time that he has all these negative comments about Christianity and about Jesus in his later writings. So I'm not sure exactly what to make of it, and maybe he rejected this. That's what has been said to me, that this was good. It was never published because he rejected what he wrote there in his later writings.
That is a great introduction to the last few points I'd like to speak about right now, which is the fact that these books, as you said, have been suppressed. And for many years, our access to Rav Kook's writings were mediated by editors, in particular, as you mentioned, his son, Rav Tzvi Yehuda, and Rav David Cohen, the Nazir. They were the ones who edited his writings. And the editing is, as I understand it, I'm not going to call it radical enough, but strong enough such that they can almost be called, I think, co-authors, because the way they shape his writings and the things they chose to leave in and the things they chose to leave out are quite important. So I want to ask, in terms of the published writings until the 21st century, things like Orot, Orot HaKodesh, things of that sort, how much of that can be considered the actual ideas of Rav Kook, and how much must be considered some sort of co-authorship with the Nazir and his son?
Well, I dealt with this in Changing the Immutable. I have a chapter on Rav Kook. There's two aspects. The first is what they didn't publish. That's the issue in of itself. And even what they published, there was some slight editing there, here and there, sometimes more substantial editing in a variety of ways, which does soften many of Rav Kook's formulations. In a few areas, you can make the case that it actually turned the meaning on its head. Um, but of course, these writings are Rav Kook's writings. If you look at it in the large picture, the editing of Rav Tzvi Yehuda, and it's not just the editing, the determination of what books were to be published, they presented us with a true Rav Kook, but not the complete truth. Rav Tzvi Yehuda did not publish everything. So, for example, Rav Kook had a Hasidic side. And Rav Tzvi Yehuda was not enamored by Hasidut, and he didn't want that material to appear. The antinomian, theoretical antinomian materials, and other stuff we've spoken about, he wanted to create a certain image of Rav Kook, so of his father. So why? Well, there's a different. If you look at the students of Rav Kook, students of Rav Tzvi Yehuda, you have different approaches. Tzvi Yehuda himself never really spoke about this. Rav Kook says at one time that he's quoted as saying that you can't. You can't suppress the light. Everything has to go out there. But in another place, he says, I want to publish it, but my censors, referring to his son, Rav Charlap and the Nazir, they won't let me. So what was the reason? Now, there's different approaches. One approach, and Rav Tzvi Yehuda says this about aspects dealing with Zionism, and it could be applicable elsewhere, and his students also see this, is that there are two Rav Kooks. There's Rav Kook and Judaism, and then when it comes to Eretz Yisrael, the Eretz Yisrael Torah supersedes the diaspora Torah, that his connection to the land of Israel and his experience led to a more particularistic Rav Kook. the sense of universalism, of humanity, which you find in the earlier writings, that has been superseded. Now, others have said no, it's just that he began to focus more because he's in the land of Israel, but doesn't mean that he rejects anything, that it supersedes it. It's like Torah Rishon, and now you have Torah Sheni. It's not like we're speaking of two Rav Kooks, which, by the way, even if we were, Rav Kook and Judaism was still a gadol, so I mean, it's still important. So that's a big debate. And Rav Tzvi Yehuda, I mean, Rav Kook never said not to publish these writings. Never said not to publish the guy, his Moreh Nevuchim, never said not to publish these other works. Rav Tzvi Yehuda and the Nazir took out from the notebooks texts that they wanted to include in, let's say, Orot Kodesh. Orot is Rav Kook published that. So he took out materials. And in various other writings of Rav Kook, he also took out passages from the notebooks. But there never is a statement that from him that these things should not appear in print. It's just they need the proper time. That's one approach, that it's been superseded. If that's and when the Shmona Kvatzim appeared, Rav Aviner came out with a statement not to study the Shmona Kvatzim, that everything has to go through Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook. And today, 25 years later, everyone studies Shmona Kvatzim, even in the America's world. But Rav Aviner, when the Nevuchei Ador appeared, he said the same thing, not to study it. There's another approach, however. The other approach says that the reason Rav Tzvi Yehuda didn't publish it is not because it was superseded or anything like that. That's just with his Zionistic. He has some writings at Chutzlaretz where he doesn't have the same sort of view of the Chalutzim as he would later adopt. The second approach is that the generation wasn't yet ready for it. So what does that mean? There's two approaches here. Either that in the traditional world, today we call them the Haredim, the response would be such because they have not yet been emancipated from their Gullus type of Torah Judaism, that this would lead them to attack Rav Kook, and so that needs to be avoided. The other approach says that what does it mean the generation is not ready? The religious Zionist world is not yet ready for this. They still need to live in Eretz Yisrael and become adapted to this new type of lifestyle before it can be revealed to them. And this is a debate among the students of Rav Tzvi Yehuda. So, for instance, Rav Yaakov Ariel wrote that these new writings should not appear because he said the generation isn't ready. He said Rav Kook's reputation is not yet secure enough that and here he's referring to in the wider Orthodox world that this will create problems, and therefore we need to secure his reputation as a great posek and halachist, and then we can release it. And Rav Yoel Ben Nun replied and said, the Haredim are never going to accept Rav Kook, and therefore it's time now to release everything. And although Rav Tzvi Yehuda refused to release the Shmona Kvatzim, and after he passed away, the people who controlled it refused to release it. There were, Rav Kook had daughters, and they have descendants. They decided it was time. Apparently, they were the ones who made the decision that it's time that everything needs to be released now. And for all the new writings that have been released, it's not clear how people have copies of this. There's the actual writings of Rav Kook, and then out of Merkaz Harav, they put out their authorized versions, which are always censored. So there's identical versions of the writings that have appeared. So this is a big debate among the followers of Rav Kook, and my own standpoint is that, like Rav Kook said, you can't hold back the light, and this is what Rav Kook thought, and we're blessed that we can see what he thought.
Well, I could still argue that there's a difference between talking about a Mishnah Rishonah, a first teaching versus a latter teaching, and also something that somebody wrote down in his own private notebooks for perhaps his own private use. Do we know that he wanted these to be known by, or he was willing to let people know them? Or maybe some of the things he wrote down were his own jottings, ideas that occurred to him that later on he said, yeah, I was just thinking out loud, but it's not what I really believe. How do we know when reading things like Shmona Kvatzim that that's not what he thought?
Well, first, let's say his book, like Nevuchei Ador, is an actual book. It's not jottings with chapters and clearly designed to be published. Now they will say, well, the fact that he never published it when he came to Eretz Yisrael showed that he didn't want to publish it. Again, I'm not sure how determinate that is. We have great people all the time who choose not to publish something. Rav Chaim Brisker didn't publish either. He didn't think the Torah was at the level that it should. That doesn't mean that we don't publish it. Now, as for Shmona Kvatzim, as you say, the jottings, everything Rav Kook thought, he wrote down, and his other works, what they call the Kvatzim, Miktav Yad Kodsho, all these matters No, we do not know that Rav Kook wanted all of this to appear in print. On the other hand, we don't know that he didn't want it to appear in print. And we do know that his published writings, all the published writings we have, basically came, not referring to his halachic writings here, come out of notebooks like this, which then they took them out and they made collections out of them. And Rav Kook himself did this. Our Pile Toar, for instance, is another example of a text like this, which was censored as well when it appeared. And now we don't have to go through the gatekeepers, as it were, because we can see what Rav Kook actually wrote. But again, I'm not sure if that's when dealing with a figure like Rav Kook. I think the assumption in traditional Judaism generally is that anything a figure of that stature writes is something we can learn from. And it's important. And throughout Jewish history, we know that sages wouldn't publish halachic writings because they weren't sure of the answer. Didn't want people to rely on it. But after they pass away, the students always publish it. So I don't know why this makes any difference, whether Rav Kook intended or not. Most of the writings of great thinkers we have, many of the writings, I should say, were never published by them, and yet we learn from them, and it's very important to us. So I don't see that, and especially now that it has been published, and these have been published by people who see themselves as followers of Rav Kook. They're not in the Merkaz world, but they are nevertheless followers of Rav Kook, and some of them are even students from Merkaz who think it's important that the light should be revealed now. So I don't see this as any moral issue. It would be one thing if Rav Kook wrote explicitly that this is not to be published. I know, for instance, Rabbi Tao, he apparently is in possession of writings of Rav Kook that have never appeared in print, and he keeps them locked up, and only special students of his are able to come to his house where he gives shiur, and he initiates them into these ideas of Rav Kook. Now, if Rav Kook had said that these writings are not for the masses, or not for the average person, they're only for special people, and he wrote these to never be published, fine, I understand that. But he never said that. And Rav Tao's understanding is going to be obviously very different than others.
Right.
In
Okay.
fact, I'll just mention Rav Tao writes about one of the passages that Rav Kook says that we have to have love for everyone. Rav Tao says, obviously, that's not applicable. Everyone, I mean, Jews and non-Jews. Rav Tao says, obviously not applicable today. I mean, obviously for Rav Tao, of course, but wouldn't be obvious for other people.
Right. Okay, we're coming close to the end of our time. I have two more important questions to ask before we conclude. The first one is that we've barely talked about Zionism at all. And in your book, you barely talk about Zionism per se. Rav Kook is probably in the public mind most well known for his advocacy of Zionism and secular Zionists. Is there any philosophical connection between some of the theological innovations that we've talked about today and his support for the Zionist movement?
I don't actually see any connection. In fact, much of what I discuss dates from before you can really identify him, before he comes to Eretz Yisrael, before you can really see him as advocating for Zionism the way we think about it. And the fact that really I don't think this is connected to Zionism, I think is important because it shows that people who are not drawn to Rav Kook's view of Tzionut, they too can find much of value here. But I do think it makes sense that the same person who could reevaluate, he's always reevaluating when he sees what's going on and he sees up close the Chaotzim, and he begins to recognize their significance, that he could come up with a new approach and locate them as an important aspect of Judaism's revitalization as we come close to the Messianic era, give them theological significance. What is Rav Kook doing? He's looking at the old approach and he's saying, now the Torah is calling us to look at it in a new way. So when you have such an outlook that you're not tied to the past, but rather you see the Torah as effervescent, and each generation has to look at it anew and see what God is telling us, it's only natural that such a person would do that with everything that he looks at in terms of Torah. And with Rav Kook, you find originality and new ideas on every single page. And it's because of that effervescent personality and always seeing the Torah as something fresh, which you can always discover new ways of looking at it. I think that's the same. It's the same idea that would lead him to adopt a new approach in Eretz Yisrael and what God wants from us now, eh, with all these other areas as well. So it comes from the same source, but the ideas per se do not have a connection to Zionism.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And my final question for you, Marc, is something that you mentioned before. I'd like to expand on it a little bit. You mentioned how had Rav Kook's position on heresy that it only is called, if someone is only called a heretic, if it leads to practice and ignoring the halacha, you said, if only we knew that in the 20th and 21st centuries before now, it could have saved a lot of heresy hunting and saved us a lot of grief over time. Can you talk about some of the ideas of Rav Kook beyond that, that are important for Jews in 2025, modern Orthodox, centrist Orthodox, dati leumi Jews, who are looking to Rav Kook as a guide, some of the ideas that you emphasize, you think we should really emphasize that he pushed as well?
Well, I personally am very much drawn to the idea of God speaking through the religious masses. The Torah is not just the inheritance of the great Torah scholars. That Torah is everyone's, and as I said, the Gemara says, go out and see what the masses are doing, the religious masses. So I think that's something that should be stressed, and that really is in the religious Zionist world something. It's famous that when Rav Kook came out against women voting, some things that Rav Kook says. Every great thing you have to speak of enduring and transitory elements. Some aspects of Rav Kook, I think we can agree, are transitory. How we decide that's a different question. But his idea of women voting, his opposition to it, which isn't halachic, it's more, it's not even spiritual. It's more societal. That the woman's role is in the home, the man's role is outside. He speaks about it would destroy shalom bayis if husband and wife don't vote the same. Um, so when he came out with this ruling, Rabbi Yehuda Maimon, the leader of the Mizrahi, said to Rav Kook, "Excuse me, Rav Kook, when it comes to halacha, we're going to listen to you, but in areas like this, we, the people, Amcha, Klal Yisrael, we can make our own decisions." And ironically, from Rav Kook's very writings, you can derive that same lesson, that not everything comes from the rabbis, and maybe in this area, Rav Maimon saw clearer that in the modern world, precisely women need to have more of a role. So I think that's very important. Of course, also the idea of a broad curriculum. Particularly for the reason Rav Kook said that this was adopted by the various modern Orthodox yeshivas, not because of Rav Kook. They just recognized it on their own. I think today they'd be happy to know Rav Kook said it, that if we limit students, we're going to push them away because not everyone is drawn to intensive Talmud study, and people need to be given other avenues to explore. And even in his more fundamental points about natural morality, all these areas I discuss within the book, I think for the modern Orthodox world, it's important to know about it because many people come with ideas and come up with feelings and ideas, and if they feel that this is an opposition to Torah, then what do they need to be part of a Jewish community for? What do they need to be a Torah community? They can throw it all off. Rav Kook shows us that many of the things that intuitively we feel really can be included in Torah. And even if I say at the end, even if we don't take Rav Kook's answers, at least he opened the door and showed us the direction, how we're supposed to go. And so in that sense, he's still a very, very important leader, quite apart from Zionism. Obviously, Zionism is very important. And I don't want to get into now, Tzvi Yehuda, the land, all that. When I think of Rav Kook and Zionism, I think of it in something differently. The idea that God was calling us. At the same time the non-Jews discovered nationalism, God was calling us to return to history, to return to and to become a complete people once again. The rest of the world is doing it. Now it's our time. And we are older than all these people. We used to be a complete people. For 1800 years, 1900 years, we were living a defective Judaism. The only spiritual way there was spirituality was through Torah study and davening. That was it. But that's because we were thrown out of the land of Israel. True Judaism, Eretz Yisrael Judaism, which was the form of Judaism that Jews were supposed to live, encompassed not just spirituality as holy, but also physicality. And Rav Kook is telling us that was so important that once again we will be the complete Jews that we're meant to be. And there was a reason why for 1800 years we only had spirituality as a way to reflect holiness, but we're not. That's not a permanent state. And that's not only an idea for the Messianic times. It's a pre-messianic time, maybe you could say, as we prepare for it. So that, I think, for me at least, is the most important idea, not about the holiness of the land and all that, but the idea that we're called once again to be complete people. So if you're in Chutz La'aretz and you have a farm, let's say, that's very nice. You provide for your family, fine. But if you're in Eretz Yisrael and you have a farm, that's a holy task. That's yeshiva Eretz Yisrael. When you job, when you're in the army in Eretz Yisrael, when you're fixing the streets, all this is what it means to be a complete people. And this is what it was intended when we came into the land of Israel from the desert. And then we were exiled. And now it's time to return and to be a complete Jew once again, where everyone, Rav Kook says that everyone has different talents. He says, by the way, about the nations, all nations have different talents, but among the Jewish people, we all have different talents, but we all are one unity. We come together, and that can only be realized in the modern era with the return to a complete Judaism. And I think Rav Kook is the prophet of this. And I'll just say one final thing. I just mentioned the word prophet, so it occurred to me. Someone asked me in a talk I recently gave, how could Rav Kook say all these things? Wasn't he afraid of being attacked? I mentioned this at the beginning of the book. Rav Kook sees himself as a prophetic figure. Rav Kook sees himself as the one called by God. I mean, he's not always sure about this. In one passage, which the Nazir censored, he wonders, am I a false prophet? But we know that a prophet has to prophesy. He can't withhold his prophecy. Rav Kook recognized that it was time for the Jewish people to reconstruct itself in a different fashion. And he has to be the one speaking this because the other rabbis aren't. And that's why I thought, without fear, he was able to chart his own direction, which we all benefit from.
Okay, well, this has been a fantastic conversation, and the book, which again is entitled Renewing the Old, Sanctifying the New, The Unique Vision of Rav Kook, is a wonderful book. I highly recommend it, and I really, really enjoyed it. And Marc, it's always a pleasure to speak with you, Professor Marc Shapiro. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.